Miriam is our inaugural emerging scholar fellow, and we're so happy and feel so grateful and blessed to have you. To tell you a little bit about this program, this is really an innovative program that we really have Deborah to thank for. She said, there's so many young women today who know so much Torah. Let's support them. Let's support them by giving them an audience. Let's support them by giving them mentorship. We believe in pedagogy. We believe that teaching is a skill that we want to cultivate alongside the content. And so we actually had if you had been at the interviews, you would be like, okay, the Jewish people are going to be okay. Like the amount of brilliant, amazing, inspiring, every interview I've done, I don't have time for this, and I get off and I'd be like, what? And so of that amazing group, Miriam emerged as just exactly what we wanted, exactly what we needed, and we're so blessed to learn with you. And I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Zoe for helping us make this happen, for being our fearless leader, and Marianne, our sponsors, our funders, and what else do I want to say? Oh, if you really, really like Miriam, then you're in luck because AJS is here in Boston, so you can just join us next week. Are you staying or are you going
I'm going back.
Okay. Yeah. So Miriam and I are going to wear a couple hats together, but we're so happy to be here. Sorry that it's so cold.
No, it's New York.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I had such a wonderful time last time. I'm excited to be here again, and with familiar faces, some new faces, so I'm excited to get to know you and learn together. So last class, for those who are here, if you remember, we talked about laughter in rabbinic texts, and we talked specifically about the redemptive power of laughter, the constructive power, how it can be religiously and spiritually significant, and how it can help in really, difficult times. Today we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a different type of laughter, specifically what I'll call destructive laughter or mockery, derisive laughter. I wanted to start by asking you, is this something that you see in your daily life? I guess by show of hands, like, do people laugh at other people for different reasons? How often do you see that? And in what context? You can just shout out some things. Like, where do you see this happening?
My children do it all the time.
Kids do it all the time. Yeah. Adults do it too. On social media, right? Political debates, political conversations. I think this is so much a descriptor of our culture today, which is if you don't like something, let's just belittle it by laughing at it. And this is actually really not a new thing. It's not a new phenomenon. This has been a method of sort of like belittling your enemy for a very long time. So believe it or not, the rabbis do a very similar thing when they're in conversation with each other, actually, in the Beit Midrash and in their halachic debates. So what we're going to do today is look at some of those sources and think about why are the rabbis using mockery and using laughter in this way? What is their goal? Why are they doing something that maybe we wouldn't want to, teach our kids? Maybe it's not the best role model situation. So to do that, we're actually going to first look at some other sources that are not rabbinic to sort of give us a framework and also a historical context to what we're going to read in the rabbinic sources. So the first two sources on your sheet come from Philo of Alexandria, who was a 1st century Jew. He lived in Alexandria, Egypt. He was a philosopher, a biblical commentator, really awesome guy, a Jew before the rabbis came around. And he was really important for this diaspora community in Alexandria. He wrote, like I said, a lot of philosophical works, but he also acted as a representative for the Jewish community. So, as a representative, he went at one time in his life to Rome as part of an embassy to the Emperor Gaius or Caligula, and he went specifically on behalf of the Jewish community because they were experiencing pogroms, essentially, and persecutions from their local neighbors. So he went to go and speak on behalf of the Jews and to, say, we need more support back in Alexandria. So what does he say? He writes in the first source, after giving some of his instruction about the buildings, Gaius asked us an important and solemn question. Why do you not eat pork? This is what the emperor wants to know when the Jews are coming to talk to him. At this inquiry, our opponents again while they fooled and joked at our expense in this way, we were at our wits' end. Then after some time, Gaius said mockingly, "We would like to know what political rights you enjoy." So there's a couple of interesting things in this passage. Philo is acknowledging that other people, the non-Jews, are laughing at the Jews. They're making fun of the Jews, and for what reason? So there's two reasons, I think, that he points out here why they laugh. The first is because they're just laughing at the Jews' ridiculous behavior. Pork for the Romans was kind of like, I don't know, pizza in America. Like, you can find a pizza shop everywhere. They loved their pork, so they thought that it was the craziest thing that Jews didn't eat it. So they laugh at that. But the other thing that I think is really significant that he says is that partly it was because they were abused, and partly it was because they wanted to flatter the emperor. Laughter has this thing where it allows you to align with the type of person, the type of party, with the group that you think is maybe the winning party. It allows you to separate yourself from the person who's being laughed at. It's a very othering experience. It creates this dynamic between us and them. So these, people around the court very much want to other the Jews. I'll just say, if I understand the beginning of the class, please feel free to raise your hand throughout the class. I'll stop at some points for comments and questions, but always feel free to,
Okay, so also when it comes to flattery, I have a question moving yesterday where the mayor of the town gets up and he says, normally I start with a joke, but I couldn't think of one, so just off the top of my head something. He says something that's not funny, but everybody, they're rolling with laughter, they're laughing, they're whatever, and they left, and somebody in the back says, why are they laughing? It's not funny. It's not, well, we know it's not funny. It's not a joke, but we have to show him that.
Right, sometimes you just want to laugh, and I think we can probably think of experiences like this, where somebody who's important, maybe our boss, maybe somebody that we just want to like us, they say something that they think is funny, so we just have to really overcompensate with our laughter to show them that we're on their side. Exactly. Now, in the second source, Philo talks about a different kind of mockery, that people laugh at the Jews, but not just because they don't eat pork. He says, I know that such things, and this is actually, let me just give a little bit more background. This is a work on commentary on Genesis, on Bereshit. This is a book of a commentary. It's like you could open up, any type of commentary. This is similar. So he writes, I know that such things as redundant expressions in Tanakh provoke laughter and mocking derision in uncultivated men, and those lacking propriety of manners, as well as those who do not see any form or manifestation of virtue, and who attribute their own incorrigibility and stupidity as well as perversity and impudence to the Holy Scriptures. Okay, he's really going at it. I'll just summarize what he's saying. These people are laughing at Tanakh because they don't understand its true meaning. They don't understand its depth. They only see the literal meaning, right? He continues. The uneducated and the unskilled and those lacking study, their eyes of the soul having been blinded and become capricious, themselves dwell only on that which has been narrated in the story, the literal meaning, and come into context and make connections only with names and words of the narration, while being unable to penetrate and look into the visions of meaning. He's saying that people are mocking the Jews. They say, what's written in their Tanakh? Like, this doesn't make any sense. He's saying, well, they don't understand the real meaning of Scripture. They don't understand the real meaning of Tanakh. That's why they're making fun of it. And actually, Philo himself has some choice words to say about these people. So he flips the script and wants to mock them too. Now, I think this is an important context to keep in the back of your head when we get to the rabbinic sources, because mockery over textual interpretation is going to be front and center when we see it. And I want you to keep thinking about, well, why? Why does textual interpretation over Tanakh, why should that really involve and require so much mockery and this sort of belittlement? Now, just to close off this section, this is sort of the intellectual inheritance that the rabbis are going to have, right? They live in a world, they're only a couple of centuries later than Philo, they live in a world that people are making fun of them for their behaviors, for their scriptures. It's going to become even more common when Christianity takes over the empire. People make fun of the Jews. The rabbis know that. This is a mechanism that exists in the world. And actually, onto the next source, laughter as a rhetorical tool. That is actually something that we see very much in the ancient world. Cicero, and I think we met Cicero in our last class. Cicero was a 1st century BC Roman lawyer, senator, orator. He was a public speaker, essentially, and he he wrote this book called On Oratory. It's like public speaking 101, basically. And it's kind of like how to win your case in the Roman court. And he has a really long chapter on laughter, because it's actually a very powerful rhetorical tool. He writes, but to come to the third point, it certainly becomes the orator to excite laughter, either because mirth itself attracts favor to him by whom it is raised, or because all admire wit, which is often comprised in a single word, especially in him who replies, and sometimes in him who attacks, or because it overthrows the adversary, or hampers him, or makes light of him, or discourages, or refutes him, or because it proves the orator himself to be a man of taste, or learning, or polish, but chiefly because it mitigates and relaxes gravity and severity, and often, by a joke or a laugh, breaks the force of offensive remarks, which cannot easily be overthrown by arguments. He says there's actually like a number of important roles that laughter plays in a rhetorical discussion, and in a debate specifically. And I think the most important one for us is where he says it overthrows the adversary, it hampers him. He recognizes, that laughter can be a very powerful way to overcome your opponent. I mean, I can think of it for myself, the last thing I want to be is laughable. You could be wrong, you could be misguided, you could be uneducated. You don't want to be laughable. That's just kind of like the lowest of the low, and he knows that, and he's a master speaker. Actually, we know from his own speeches that he really took his own advice. He often made fun of his opponents, in not such a nice way. Any questions or comments on what Cicero said so far, or anything else? So it's interesting because these ideas, they're very ancient, but they're actually very modern. And the entire field of, especially the academic field of humor and laughter, it's been really popular in the last century, and it kind of started with Freud in the early 1900s. Not all of Freud's ideas have been accepted by modern psychology, but when it comes to laughter, everybody has to start with him and his books on jokes and their relation to the unconscious. And he writes something kind of similar to Cicero, right? He says, by making our enemies small, inferior, despicable, or comic, we achieve in a roundabout way the enjoyment of overcoming him. To which the third person, that is the audience, who has made no efforts, bears witness by his laughter. Wit will allow us to exploit something ridiculous in our enemy, which we would not, on account of obstacles in our way, bring forward openly or consciously. So he, similar to Cicero, it's really, laughter is a very powerful tool, very powerful rhetorical tool in a debate with your opponent. But he highlights actually something else that was only alluded to in Cicero, which is the power of the audience, the third person. Part of what makes laughter in a debate or when you're trying to put somebody else down, what makes that so effective is if you have an audience. If it's just you and another person debating and you laugh at them, they can easily dismiss you. If you're in a court, you're in a Roman court or a rabbinic beat Josh, and you have a whole bunch of students around and you make fun of somebody and everybody laughs, that has way more effect than if you just did it one-on-one. And that's really what he's saying. This is the third person made no effort. The third person did not mock, didn't say anything, didn't even engage in the intellectual debate, just sitting there and laughing. That is the way. The power is in the audience. There's a very performative element of laughter. It kind of feels like you're making a performance. So I think what we see from, between Philo and between our rhetorical sources, we see that mockery is a very useful tool to subvert and distort and make your enemy feel small, specifically because it kind of subverts what you might expect to happen. The last thing you want, right, is to be laughable. Now, before we continue, does any of this ring true to you? Have you seen an example that maybe you're willing to share of something where something was made to feel laughable or something was mocked in a way that really just knocked it down a few notches and it just subverted what the authority that it might have had otherwise?
It happens all the time.
Yeah.
But in politics,
yeah.
Certain politicians, something amusing happens to them. There used to be, I know Gerald before, I don't know, a little before he was, he characteristics of being clumsy. And the press, that's all you could hear about the press. And he wasn't an idiot, but it just turned into anything that he said. Then from then on, he just lost a lot of his presence and authority.
Right. And that's actually a great point, that if you do it once, if you make fun of somebody once and they do something that's laughable, you could lose their credibility for a very long time. It can have very long-lasting ramifications, and it's really very powerful.
I think there's a whole industry of television comedy shows built around this whole.
Yes.
Accomplished this way.
It is literally the goal of stand-up comedians to take punches at people of authority. And sometimes, it feels like comedy is an easier way to do it, because it's like, it's comedy, it's couched in laughter, like it's okay. I'm not saying these things publicly, I'm saying it in a comedic way. It reminds me of part of why I was interested in this is because I saw the comedy show by the comedian Alex Edelman. I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. It's actually from the Boston area.
Yes, he's familiar to the area.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
So if you haven't seen it, and I think he's in DC now, it's fantastic. And what he does through his comedy special is he basically makes fun of the KKK amidst all the anti-Semitism going on. And it's such a fantastic job of talking about something really serious and scary, but making them seem so insignificant and little and silly through his jokes about them. And he describes, going to a KKK meeting because he was just interested in seeing what it would be like, and it's really hilarious. But he's a master at being able to show you how silly and how dumb really the KKK is. They're just like, they're so not even threatening. They're just so laughable. Of course, anti-Semitism is threatening, but the way to talk about it is to use this laughter and to use this mockery to sort of incite the audience to action, but also to think worse and lesser about the opponent. So that's really what kind of got me thinking about this. I thought it was fantastic. Any other examples, or
Even older, and growing up, I watched a lot of, my parents took me to a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan musicals, and they were all political, but they were in a way, they were all humorous to make fun of the king, basically in the same way my daughter was talking about, how Shakespeare was to make fun,
right?
Because you couldn't make fun in any other way, you couldn't belittle in any other way. So it was ambiguous enough that the people who were acting and the people who were writing the plays and all of that, they wouldn't get in trouble, their lives wouldn't be threatened.
Right, exactly, yes. It feels non-threatening, but it has actually very important impacts. It's very impactful. Good. Yeah.
Well, on the other side, sometimes it can backfire. For example, actually in the late 30s, even early 40s, in America, they were making fun of Hitler. They were, the mustaches, they were making jokes, they were doing all kinds of stupid, ridiculous things. But instead of just bringing him down and, forget about it, it was like almost underestimating the power that he actually had to our detriment.
So I think you bring up a great point, which is that laughter has to be used in a way when you're equal to your opponent, right? It's hard to be used, it's not always as effective if really you're trying to take aim at something that's much greater than you and much more serious. Laughter is often very effective when it's, when you're on an equal playing field with your opponent. Now, Alex Edelman is not on equal playing field with the KKK, but he still does a great job. But I think the rabbis, as we'll see, are more on a similar playing field. Now, before we get into the rabbinic sources, I want us to think about this mechanism of laughter and derision. Is this something that you would expect to see in the Beit Midrash? I know, I want you to say no, but maybe it would, right? Maybe it would be.
Everything.
You see everything in the Beit Midrash.
They live there so often, everything happens there.
Everything happens. So it might not be so surprising. And it's a good point. Actually, in the Beit Midrash, we know that the stakes are very high, and they feel very committed to their positions, and they often use insults and put down other rabbis. And they'll specifically laugh at them. So before we get into it, just to review and to summarize, we talked about laughter as sort of a rhetorical tool, it belittles your enemy, and also as a way to create group identification, for you to identify with a certain mindset, with a certain group, and for you to other somebody else, or to distance from somebody else and their ideology. So it has a very social function, and also a rhetorical function. Okay, any other comments or questions? Great, so what I have actually been studying and researching, and I'll be talking about it at HAS next week, is a few of these cases of mockery in the Beit Midrash, and specifically when they use a term of using the verb machach in a certain way, of laughter and mocking laughter, and it usually happens, no, it always happens, in the midst of a halachic discussion. So having like a regular halachic debate that you would see if you opened any page of Talmud, and then in the middle of it, it just says he suggested an interpretation, and then they laughed at him. And I was reading this, and I was like, what's going on? Why are they laughing at him? Like, they don't always laugh. So we're going to look at two of those examples, and I want us to think about, using these frameworks in mind, that we talked about laughter and mockery, and why do you think it's happening here, in this specific debate? And we'll talk about that after each example. Now, the first example comes from Bali in Masechet Berachot. Actually, it only appears in the Bali, this type of phrase, and if there's time at the end, we can talk about why I think it's not in the Yerushalmi. So one of these examples happens in Berachot, and it's this part of this really long sugya, a Tashma sugya about Chavod Habriyot, about human dignity. And we start off with this verse from Mishle, from Proverbs, that says, "En chokhmah ve'en tuna ve'en etzah leneged Hashem." There's neither wisdom nor understanding nor counsel against the Lord. And this pasuk, this verse, is taken as the principle that human dignity may not override a biblical commandment, a deoraita law. This is sort of the principle that is at the head of the sugya, and then the rest of the sugya tries to come to disprove that principle. So this is one of these little sections that tries to disprove it. So I'll read it in the Hebrew, Aramaic, and in English. Tashma, so come in here. Gadol Chavod Habriyot shedofet lo ta'aseh shebat Torah. Great is human dignity, as it can override a prohibition in the Torah. A prohibition meaning a negative commandment, a lo ta'aseh. Ve'amai, lema ein chokhmah ve'ein tunah ve'ein etzah leneged Hashem. How could this be? Let us say there's no wisdom, understanding, or counsel against the Lord, meaning we just said in our previous principle that human dignity does not override a Torah commandment. So how could you say that it overrides a lo ta'aseh? Targuma Rav Bar Shava Kamei de Rav Kahana Belav de lo tasur. Should say tasur. Rav Bar Shava explained before Rav Kahana, no. This idea that human dignity can override a lo ta'aseh, that's only referring to lo tasur, which comes from Dvarim. In context, talks about obeying the judgments of the judges, basically the rulings. And in rabbinic law, maybe some of you know, what does lo tasur refer to in rabbinic law? It refers to all rabbinic enactments, essentially. So he said, no, this idea of human dignity can override a lo ta'aseh, it's only referring to lo tasur. So what's the response of the Beit Midrash? Achiku aleh. They laugh at him. My tama achiku. Lo tasur deoraita. So why do they laugh at him? Because the prohibition of you shall not deviate, what we just said, lo tasur, is Torah law. So how could that answer the question? Right? The original question was, human dignity cannot override a Torah commandment. But then we just brought this principle that maybe human dignity can override a lo ta'aseh. But no, the lo ta'aseh is only referring to lo tasur. That doesn't really answer the question, because lo tasur is still a Torah commandment. So that doesn't really solve the issue that human dignity cannot override a Torah commandment. Is that clear? Like, does the logic and flow why they laugh at him make sense?
Can you give an example of human dignity not overriding?
Yeah, so something like embarrassing to somebody, if let's say, I'm trying to think, if let's say something would cause somebody embarrassment or shame in public, then you might say that they don't have to keep a certain halacha or something in this particular moment. So something like that. Whereas it's not a legal halachic thing, but we're trying to embarrassment in public. Which, by the way, we're literally talking about human dignity, right? And then they laugh at him in the middle of a conversation about shame and human dignity and embarrassment, and I don't think that's an accident. So let's continue reading. So they laugh at him. So, they laugh at him. Why? This is not a good answer to our question, right? You say you shall not deviate, but that's also a Torah law. So that's not really a good answer. Amar lahu Rav Kahana, Gava Rabba, Amar Milta, Lo Tachiku Alei. Rav Kahana, who's the older teacher in the room, he says, a great man has spoken. Don't laugh at him. Which is very nice. We don't always have people sticking up for us. Kol asmachta mile derabanan alav lo tasur asmachenu umishum kvodov sharu rabanan. So he explains, or somebody explains, perhaps the anonymous voice of the Talmud explains, all rabbinic prohibitions are based on the prohibition of lo tasur, of you shall not deviate. And because of dignity, the sages, the rabbis, permitted it. They permit kavod hariyot to override all rabbinic commandments. Now, there's two really important things to point out here. First of all, we're talking about human dignity, and then they laugh at the rabbi while they're talking about, like, oh, how important is human dignity? Like, I don't know, but you just said something silly, so I'm going to laugh at you. So that happens, which I think is really interesting. And the fact that the verse, lo tasur, that the rabbi is trying to suggest can be overridden by human dignity, is actually referring to all rabbinic prohibitions. Basically, he's saying human dignity is more important than the rabbi's laws. So maybe that's why they laugh at him. He's basically telling them, yeah, everything we're doing here is great, really important, halakha is great, conversations are so important and we need rabbinic authority, but kavod hariyot is more important. And maybe they don't like that, because he's challenging the authority, he's challenging the hegemony, and I think that's something that we see pretty often. Somebody standing up against, the leadership, a very easy way to knock them down is to just laugh at them. That dismisses them immediately. And not only is he trying to challenge an authority, he's challenging his own authority. He's still part of the group. He has a dissenting opinion. And he's trying to challenge that. And they laugh at him. Now, just a couple more things and then we'll pause for questions. It's also significant that perhaps they didn't understand what he meant. Perhaps they thought he was really referring to a Torah commandment, and then we needed somebody else to explain to us that no, he's really referring to rabbinic commandments. Maybe they thought he had the literal meaning of the pasuk in mind, when really he had the rabbinic meaning of the pasuk in mind. Now this reminds me of what we talked about with Philo, that people made fun of the Jews because they only understood the literal meaning and not the deeper meaning. I think a very similar thing is happening here, where the rabbis only see the literal meaning of what Rav Bar Shava is saying, and therefore they laugh at him. Now, when we understand the deeper meaning, that really we're referring to rabbinic enactments, not to Oraita enactments, then we can rehabilitate him, and therefore his position is not laughable anymore. So there's two important things that I want us to take away from this conversation. The first is that he's challenging the authority on his own team. He's trying to say, look, your laws are great, but human dignity is more important. And maybe they don't like that so much. The second thing, there's something here about the literal and the non-literal interpretation of Tanakh that is in tension. And the rabbis are laughing at his first interpretation because they don't see the deeper meaning behind it. So I want to just pause to make sure for comprehension and make sure that everybody understands, I know halachic sugyot can sometimes be a little bit confusing because they rely on you to know so much of what happened before. So I hope that this was clear, but please let me know if there's anything confusing in the sugya itself, or if you have any other thoughts about why they're laughing at each other.
No, it's just that, this is a story where the laughers turn out to be, in the end, they're the ones who look somewhat
Silly,
ridiculous.
yeah.
They look silly and,
Yeah.
small.
Good. I mean, and it's great for bringing that up because who defends Rav Barshava? Rav Kahana, and the last line of the Gemara. We don't know who said the last line of the Gemara. I call this the stam, the anonymous voice of the Gemara. I think it's really important that there's two layers here. The rabbi himself defends him. He says, like, he's a great guy, like, don't make fun of him. But the stam, the person who's putting together the sugya, who's editing it, really doesn't like this thing about rabbis laughing at each other. So he has to explain why the position makes sense. So I think, keep that in mind. But I think that that's very important, and it's good to recognize that, even though they laugh at him, he gets rehabilitated. Like, something about the Gemara is not comfortable with this happening in the Beit Midrash.
Just a couple clarifying questions.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, is there a level of the laughter that he says something that's just inaccurate or incoherent?
Yeah, I think it's that it's incoherent to them. They think that it just doesn't answer the question. Like, it doesn't make sense. Why is Lo Tasur any different than any other biblical law?
And is that a pattern you see when you're looking at this?
Yes. So we'll look at one more example, but yes, I think that what I see in studying these sugya is that the rabbis make fun of an interpretation when they don't understand it, and when they think that it means something that it doesn't. And usually it's about this literal versus non-literal meaning. They see it on one level, but the original response has a deeper meaning to it.
But is there a pattern within the incoherence? Like, is it always that it seems like someone's offering an answer that just doesn't answer the question?
It's usually that it's an incorrect reading of a pasuk. It's a literal reading of a pasuk. That's usually what it is. And that's what they make fun of. They make fun of literal readings of pasukim. They don't like literal interpretations. It's really interesting. Yeah.
So it's not also that it's challenging.
Yeah.
Because in this case, it's not just literal, but it's challenging to them.
Right.
But is it the literalness that's sufficient?
I think that would be sufficient enough. I think that it's important that it's here specifically because there's often times where rabbis will suggest a literal interpretation and they just say like, no, whatever, they move on. But I think here, especially, they continue with it and they laugh, not only because it's literal, but also because if you actually understand it, then it's going to challenge their authority. So there's two levels here. One is literal, and one is if it's not literal, then it challenges them really significantly.
Just wondering if you think it's relevant that he says he's like a great man has spoken. So would it be different than if it's someone said it who wasn't in that high position, someone who we expect should be respected, or we should have assumed that he knows what he's talking about if he's a great man versus your conversation.
Great. I think that's an excellent question. This phrase, Gaba Rabba, appears only a handful of times, and it's not always referring to a greater stature. It's not always somebody who's necessarily like older or more senior or something. I think actually, in this case, Rav Kahana actually cares about the person's dignity, which makes sense, because that's what they're talking about. But I think it's a really good question, and it does require a little bit more analysis. Like, why does he get defended this way? Let me just continue with a couple of other things, and then we'll talk more about this. I just want to focus for just 2 minutes on the literary context of this sugya. This comes in the middle of a very long couple of pages, kind of all about dignity. If you look at the left side of this little chart, the dot before, or the amud before, has this section that starts, Amar Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi, ב-24 מקומות, בית דין מן הדין על כבוד הרב, וכולן שנינו במשנתנו. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, I'm in that chart now, Berachot 19a. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, there are 24 places in which the court ostracizes over respect to the rabbi. And we learned all of them in our Mishnah. So this comes right before, and then it starts to list, by the way, all the cases in which we ostracize because we excommunicate somebody if they're not respectful to the rabbis. This comes before our story, and then after our story, look at the right side of your chart on Berachot 20a. This is really directly after our story. Amar le Papa le Rabbi, Mashna Kamei Demitkarish le Nisa, Umashna Anan de Lo Mitkarish la Nisa. So Rav Papa says to Rabbi, what's different about earlier generations for whom miracles occurred. And what's different about our generation? That we don't get miracles. Our earlier ancestors, they had miracles. Why don't we get miracles? What does he say? Amarle, kamei masrei nafshehu akdushat Hashem, anan lo mafrina nafshin akdushat Hashem. He says the previous generation were dedicated to the sanctification of God's name, while we are not as dedicated to the sanctification of God's name. So that we are lacking in our midot. We are not as good of people as the previous generation. I think it's very significant that not only is this laughter placed in the center of a conversation about kavod and but a couple lines before we're talking about kavod for the rav, for the rabbi, and a couple of lines later we're talking about how we're not good enough people anymore. We don't have good midot. It's a really long literary construction about what it means to offer dignity to other people and how to dignify other people. And really, like, right at the center of it is our little narrative about the mockery and about the laughter. And this comes back to the stum, to the editor, the anonymous editor of the Gemara. I think they're trying to show us something about the importance of shaming and embarrassment in the Beit Midrash. I think it's trying to show us that it happens, it's not okay. It's not really the way we should be doing things. And he's showing us that very subtly, not saying like, well, this is really bad. He's showing us that through these sort of literary, contextual clues about where something is placed. This happens a lot in this Talmud. Yeah?
I find it interesting the positioning of Rav Kahana here, because Rav Bar Shava was actually explaining before him, and it was the people around that laughed. And so it seems like it's Rav Kahana that has like the most kind of kavod in this situation. And so I wonder also, like, what's the role of him as the most important person in the room, as it were?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I can imagine a scenario in which, a bunch of students are in a room. One student says something that is kind of silly, so everybody else laughs, and they hope that the teacher's going to laugh with them, right? It's like the teacher's that last person standing. Who's he or she going to join? Which side? And as soon as the teacher joins Rav Bar Shava's side, that's it. The whole thing falls apart. They need that person with authority, and I think that that's a really good point. And again, it harkens back to what we said earlier about this performative element, right? Like, it's really, you kind of like doing a performance over here in front of a whole group. Like, who's he going to join? I'm going to laugh at him to make him look bad, and I need the teacher on my side. There's really a very strong performative element to it. Any other questions? Yeah.
It looks to me like Rav Kahana is teaching a very extremely important point, and it may not be in the Talmud, but Derech Eretz Kadmalator.
Yeah.
And these are, I know they're learning in Beit Midrash and everything, but they're the rabbis who are also going to paskin for the community at large. And if you don't have respect for people where they are, then the people aren't going to trust you to paskin for them, and whatever you decide, or this is the law, whatever, people aren't going to have respect for that because you don't have respect for them. So he's teaching them that. I mean, the story of the student-based midrash who's newlywed and the wife who is pregnant, and she says, "Can you take the garbage out?" And so because I'm a student-based midrash beneath me. So she goes and she complains to the rabbi. And the next day, in the morning, just before the husband is going out, the Rav is at the door, and he says, "Oh, why are you at the door for?" And he says, "I came to take out your garbage."
Right. Yeah, I think these stories highlight that not only is it important, but I think it highlights that there's really a risk in maybe Jewish circles, maybe Beit Midrash circles, where you have that sort of elitism because you're the leaders. There's maybe an extra risk of falling into these patterns, of really not offering dignity to everybody involved. Yes, I think that's great. If there's any other thoughts or questions, yeah.
I was actually just being reminded of a study I saw once about students. I work in school. So the people doing the study had 2 teenage actors and 1 adult actor, and they were to act out in different permutations a bullying scenario in front of other teenagers. So teacher's in the room, teacher's not in the room. The teacher reacts, the teacher doesn't react. The teacher joins in the bullying, And what was fascinating to me that I had not, that then they check to see what the other teenagers
Yeah.
do. Are they going to shut it down? Are they going to join in? Are they just going to go away? And the absolute worst scenario, as far as the other teens joining in, was a teacher being in the room and not reacting.
Yeah.
The
Wow.
teacher out of the room, the kids stood up for the other kid.
Right.
The teacher
That's
in the room
really,
joining
really
in the bully,
interesting.
the kids fight with the teacher.
Right. Right, it goes back to Zoe's question, like what is the role of the teacher in the room? The teacher in the room has a ton of power. If the teacher doesn't do anything, I just taught to a class in Stern College where I'm TAing. We just did the stories of the destruction of the temple. We did the Bar Kamsa story, right? And if you're familiar with it, one of the things that they complain about is that everybody's at this party where this horrible things happen. They shame, they embarrass this person, and they say the rabbis were there and did nothing. And I think that is, that's great. It's a great psychological reading on this narrative also, that when the leadership is not involved, then that's really when things devolve, and that's when things get worse. There's other sources that I didn't bring where somebody gets laughed at, and then the rabbi was like, yes, it's good he got laughed at, which is like terrible. But then the anonymous voice comes back to rehabilitate him. It's really important for this Gemara itself to make the rabbis have coherent positions.
You don't have to answer this now, just as we're going to the next question. I'm still intrigued, like, how are you defining a literal translation, if that's the pattern?
Okay, good. Yes. Literal is, a better word might be contextual, like looking at the context of the Tanakh, like where the pasuk is, and a non-contextual reading is probably something like a rabbinic interpretation of it. So maybe midrash, or like the way that the rabbis understand it in the rabbinic mindset. So you know what, let's look at one more source, and hopefully that'll answer the question. So this comes from Zami. We're talking about the necessary requirements, measurements of the mizbeach. They're just talking about the measurements of the different items in the Beit Mikdash. So they say midah, midah v'chorbo, midah chomato, and ma'afim. So the measurement of the altar's length, the measurement of its width, the measurement of its height are not preventative, meaning without them, it could still be an acceptable altar. Meaning it could be any size, any length, it could have any measurements essentially, and it could still be an acceptable mizbeach. Amar Bimani, ubelvad shelo yipachot mimizbecho shel Moshe. So they say, okay, this is fine as long as it's not smaller than the mizbeach of Moshe, meaning the original mizbeach in the desert. It can't be smaller than that. Like, that's not acceptable. So they asked Kama. So, and how large was the altar constructed by Moshe? Amar Yosef, Amma. He says 1 cubit. So they laugh at him. Achiku alei. 5 amot erech, v'chamesh amot rechav. So they say, they laugh at him and they quote a pasuk, the pasuk from Shemot that literally says it should be 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. 5 cubits all around. So they laugh at him because why are you saying 1? It literally says 5. You know, it's such a blatant contradiction to the literal contextual meaning of a pasuk. It's very obvious. Amar le Abaye, Dilma makom archa kamar rab. So Abaye says, no, maybe our master over here, our teacher, is speaking about the area of the arrangement of the wood, which that was actually 1 cubit, because they give measurements and elsewhere in rabbinic literature, but they explain that it's 1 square cubit on the inside, and the other 4 square cubits are the places where the Kohanim would walk, and there was other things that they would put on them. So he says, Kari alehu b'nei ketorah. So he calls them b'nei ketorah. Oh, sorry, I skipped one line over here. The important line over here. Amar le'mar tegavra rabba. So he says, Abaye says, this master, my teacher, he's a great man, he knows what I mean to say. So Gavra Rabba here is used differently, right? Before it was used to defend him. Here it's used to sort of express gratitude to the person who defended him. And then what does he do? What does he do? He applies the verse to the children of Keturah. Who's Keturah in Tanakh? Abraham's second wife. Right. So what does that insult mean to you? He calls the other rabbis in the room b'nei Keturah. Insignificant. What did you say? Yeah, insignificant. Just, here are the other children to this little sugya over here. What does it say? It says, B'nai achatei de Rabbi Tarfon, hahu yatve kamei de Rabbi Tarfon. So the sons of Rabbi Tarfon's sisters were sitting with Rabbi Tarfon, they were learning with him, but they were not saying anything. This is just like another story to explain the insult. So they're sitting, they're learning, Rabbi Tarfon, he's trying to engage them, he's struggling. Patach amar v'yosef Abraham v'yikach isha ushma Yochani. So he starts reading the pasuk, and he says, Abraham took another wife, and her name was Yochani. Wrong. And it doesn't say Yochani. So he's trying to see if they're awake and alert. Sometimes, I don't think this is a good pedagogical method, but this is maybe what he was trying to do at the time. So Amrule, Inu Ketorah, they say, no, it says Ketorah, not Yochani. So finally they're able to participate. Kari Alehu B'nai Ketorah. So what does he do? He applies the verse to them. You're B'nai Ketorah. So I think this is trying to show this postscript. It's not just an insult, like, oh, you're the insignificant sons. It's, you're not able to contribute anything other than what the text says. You're not able to understand that there's a deeper meaning to the text. And I think it's the same thing with Rav Yosef. They're not able to understand that when he's talking about Amma Achat, one Amma, he's referring to something different that we know from other rabbinic texts elsewhere. We're talking about the rabbinic interpretation of the Mizbeach, not the biblical interpretation of the Mizbeach. So it has a similar dynamic here of the rabbis mocking somebody for not understanding the non-literal meaning of the verse that this rabbi is proposing. We also here have a very similar performative element, right? It's in front of other people. We have this postscript where it's really very performative. It's in front of it says in front of his students, he insults them. Again, and the insult is again about the literalism of Tanakh. And here again, he gets defended. And I would argue again, two types of defenses. One is from Rav Yosef, one is from Abaye, and one is from the Gemara itself. By putting the extra story after it to, make the insult even stronger, the Gemara is even defending him another way. Any thoughts or comments on questions on that one? This one I think is a little bit easier to understand in terms of what's happening. It's like a very, it flows. It doesn't have the same impact in terms of, he's questioning all rabbinic authority. That's certainly not what's happening here. But there is certainly a sense of they're misunderstanding his reading of Scripture. And that's very, very important to the rabbis. To read Tanakh correctly the stakes are, you can't even express how high the stakes are. Go back to Philo all those centuries ago. It was really important to Philo then. It's even more important to the rabbis when they're writing this, because they're in the process of constructing a group identity. They're in the process of creating rabbinic Judaism. And it really matters that you understand Tanakh the rabbinic way and you're on our side. So when they think that somebody doesn't understand the rabbinic way, we need to other them. We need to laugh at them. Yeah.
So I sort of have this question that's popping up is that the text is saying it's okay to belittle the people who sort of belittle. Mm-hmm. It's okay to shame the people who sort of shame. In other words, the text is saying, well, there are contexts where it's okay to sort of, obviously calling them the children of Torah is shaming and belittling. It's sort of doing what they're, so is the text then telling us, well, there are actually cases like if you belittle someone who's a great man, well, then it's okay to shame you.
Good, I think that's a really good point. What do you think? Do you think that it's okay if somebody makes fun of you? Is it okay to make fun of them back? I think it's okay to say that maybe this is not the greatest advice. Hey, you're going to say something?
I think that it's all about human nature. The Torah is full of, the not so nice sides of all of our great sages, right? So here too, we're given the entire dynamic of the conversation to know that even the greatest, it's very into highs, immediately be literal and belittle, and we hear how it was resolved. So we think next time we have that urge
The Gemara is describing the dynamic between rabbis. It doesn't mean that we're supposed to emulate every single thing that they do. We certainly do things that we shouldn't be emulating. And I think this kind of mockery and the derision that they use in the Beit Midrash, we shouldn't necessarily be emulating it, just because we know that's not the right thing to do, but also because the Gemara is telling us it's not a nice thing to do. The actual way that the Gemara is constructed is telling us it's going to backfire. Either you're going to get made fun of, or like you're going to feel silly for even doing it. So because we have that context, we know that maybe it's not the the right thing, the way to go about. Yeah.
Is the term achiku, is that commonly used, like I see in the next section it says
Oh, yes.
You know, so
Good.
I'm curious about that.
So achiku and machak is the shorish, specifically is about mockery. Not that common. It is used in other cases. And it's always a derision type of thing. Schok has a greater realm, I would say. It could be positive laughter. Last week we saw tzachak. It was a positive, not last week, a few weeks ago. It was positive. Sometimes, like in the next verse, it's negative. But machak, the verb that we've been using, achiku, is always about mockery. And it's not so common. It's a good point. Yeah.
In the talking, is this context having anything to do with actually the Mikdash, or is it also about, I'm going to slide in the story about respect?
No, so this one is actually about the Mizbeach. Yeah. I know you want it to be, right? Like, I want it to secretly be about respect also. I don't know, I think about some drama. Yeah, I don't know. But no, you're right. It is actually about the Mizbeach. And that's why this one really drives the point home, because there's a literal pasuk that says the opposite, Rabbi Yosef, of what you said. You said 1, there's a pasuk that says 5. And then they explain, no, really 1 is referring to only the inside portion of the Mizbeach. Yeah.
Well, they don't back up. I thought what's interesting in this one, in addition to what you said, which was maybe not a great example of how to behave in a group or lead a group, but then they don't, and maybe this is the case where you could, quiet the shame, quiet the bullies, because they don't come back and actually give context for the area of only the arrangement.
Yeah.
Good. And
Right.
I know that that's even true.
Right.
So maybe the conversation's over.
It sounds like the conversation's over.
Yosef, Rabbi Yosef is wrong. Or whatever. They kept his, Abaye was careful to not embarrass him in the context of other people's worst behavior, but maybe it wasn't really worth continuing this conversation.
Yes, it sounds like they just shut it down. Like it's not worth continuing this conversation, which is, and always when this appears, there's different, outcomes, ramifications. I would argue that they all, in some form or another, kind of show that mockery is not the best policy in the Beit Midrash. But yeah, sometimes it doesn't end up where the rabbis acknowledge that they don't apologize, whatever. It doesn't always end with the happy ending that we would like to see.
Also, I would add in a sad way that it ends with mocking children.
Yeah.
So
Exactly. When we talk about group identification, us versus them, they love to do this in Tanakh. I just gave a shiur yesterday on Shabbat about what the rabbis do to Esav as a character, right? They love to look at characters in Tanakh and identify them with us versus them and other them. So I think that's a great point, how they're reading the Tanakh. Steve, did you have something?
No, isn't it substantively different, sort of hermeneutically or whatever the interpretation that Rav Bar Shava offers in the first source you brought and here? Because here they're laughing at Rabbi Yosef because they think he's literally wrong, right?
Yeah.
And there, would you say they're laughing because they think he's actually literally wrong?
I think so. I think you're laughing because he's literally wrong in the previous one, because he says lo tasor, which is a deoraita. So how can that answer the question, right? The question was, we need to find something that's not a deoraita, and then he offers a deoraita. So they think he's literally wrong. So I think that they're parallel in that way. In the remaining few minutes that we have, I want to look at the last source as sort of, this is a theoretical, this comes from Midrash. It's different than Talmud. It's not a halachic discussion. It's a Midrash about the way that mockery subverts what's logical or what's expected. So I'll read it and we'll discuss what we think that the rabbis are trying to say by including this. So they choose a verb from Kohelet. It comes from Kohelet Rabbah. Anger is better than laughter, and a cross countenance of the heart as for the cross countenance, the heart will be bettered. Right, we're going to get to that after the pasuk in a minute. So tov ka'as mitzvot amar Shlomo ilu ka'as aba al adonya kim'a tov haya lo mitzvot shesachaka alav midan hadin. So Shlomo says, had my father been a little angry at Adonya, it would have been better for him than the laughter with which the attribute midan hadin, the attribute of justice, mocked him. So why? Because had he had a cross countenance, meaning had he given him a little bit of rebuke, a little tochacha, he would have bettered himself. He would have caused him to better his ways. Instead, his father had never aggrieved him. Talking about David. We know that David had a lot of issues with his kids, and a lot of it is because he didn't actually, rebuke them or, tell them that what they're doing is wrong. And the rabbis understand, well, what happened, it's not karma, but it's midat hadin laughing mockingly at the situation. You don't take care to control the situation and make it better, well, this is what happens. Midat hadin literally subverts what you would hope for. It gives another example. Ken Amnon, right? Another one of David's children. Tov haya im ka'as David aba al Amnon kim'am mitzvot shesachaka alav midat hadin ve'lama ki baro panim mitavled ela ki Amnon levado met. So it would have been better. Amnon, also a very sad story. All of this is in Shemuel Malachim with Tamar. It would have been better had David been a little bit angry with him. Would have been better than what midat hadin that it left at Amnon, because he dies alone. It's just a very sad ending. Midat hadin laughter is not always positive. It's not going to bring positive results. It's often going to subvert what you hope for and what would be best for everybody involved. And now it brings even another type of way that it lasts. Devar her tov ka'as mitzvot. Tov haya ilu ka'as hakadosh baruch hu al dor hamabul mitzvot shesachaka alehem midat hadin she'emar zar amnachon lifnehem. It says it would have been better if God got angry at the generation of the flood, at dor hamabul, then midat hadin, which laughed at them, and what's the mockery that midat hadin gave them? Their offspring are established before them. It puts this pasuk with dor hamabul, that they end up being existing. The rabbis are saying it would have been better if God was angry at them and then just destroy them. Instead, we get midat hadin laughing at the world, being like, see, you didn't get angry at them, now I can make them a great nation. So the rabbis are saying God should have just really punished them and gotten rid of them. And a very similar thing they say with Sodom, right? Had God been angry with Sodom, it would have been better than the laughter that midat hadin laughed at them, which says their houses are safe without fear. They live in safety and tranquility, right? Back to our last class that we talked about, that this subversion, it's confusing. This is mockery. That is what mockery does. It subverts what you would expect. It subverts good and evil. And this is what it does theoretically in heaven, but also in your social dynamics, with the rabbis in the Beit Midrash. It's a very powerful, going back to Freud and to Cicero, very powerful rhetorical tool to subvert what your opponent meant to say and to make them look foolish, to make them look belittled, silly, like they have nothing worthwhile to say. Now, if all that's true, right, we see mockery is something that the non-Jews do. They laugh at the rabbis. Philo talks about it. We know laughter is a very important rhetorical tool. Why do the rabbis use it? What do you think? We looked at some examples. Why do you think the rabbis do it? I think we talked a little bit about it while we were going through the sugyot, which is that the stakes are very high for them, right? When it comes to interpretation, this is very important. It's significant to them, right, to have that group identification. And I would say further that the rabbis are not living in a closed-off, little enclave. The Beit Midrash is actually more similar to a Roman court than you might imagine. They are living in this world, in the greater world. These tools exist in the world around them, and they're going to use it also in their own lives. Now, I'm not saying that that's a good thing, and I think the Gemara, like we said, is also saying that it's probably not the best thing to do. but the rabbis do use it. It's a very powerful rhetorical tool. And we know that they use a lot of other Roman rhetorical tools in their conversations. And this way allows them to embolden their positions, their interpretations of Tanakh, and it allows them to what they think is to come to truth and to create a strong rabbinic group. And it often doesn't work out so well for them. But at the end of the day, like they all have good interpretations. So I think really what I want to close off, and then we could talk more if anybody has any comments or questions. We see that mockery is present in the Beit Midrash. It's not just this happy, harmonious place where everybody gets along. They argue, they shame each other, they embarrass each other. There's a performative element. The audience is there, they laugh. This happens, and it's really tied to textual interpretation. It's tied to group identification, to us versus them. But often, as we saw, the other rabbis or the Stam tries to remedy that and tries to stand up for the mocked rabbi, which is, I think, the lesson that we could probably take. We should be the Stam, we should be the ones to always make sure that we're standing up for the other person. So thank you so much, and please, if you have any other comments or questions, I'd love to hear. Yeah.
I think that in terms of a person who is being laughed at, or being corrected, humiliation is not corrected.
Yeah.
Humiliation is shaming.
Yeah.
So if you're laughed at, you go away. I mean, maybe you cry, maybe you just leave the conversation, whereas if you're corrected, it gives you something constructive to work on.
Great, yeah.
And I think that it may be that in certain situations the rabbi just wanted to get rid of somebody and not bother to exchange ideas with that person.
Yeah, it's a very quick, pacey, easy result, to just laugh at somebody because you just dismiss them and you don't have to actually engage with them. And you're right, like modern psychology, we know this now, that humiliation is not really actually going to be that effective. There's other more effective ways of getting somebody to correct their behavior. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It seems like in both of the cases, there's a it's a more important topic than you might think on the surface, because the whole idea of what the extent of rabbinic authority is sort of at the heart of that lo tasor. It's like, oh, you think because, somebody might think because the Torah says to listen to the rabbis, then there's carte blanche, and then they're obviously, it's obviously a question that's being debated, not just in the Beit Midrash, but maybe in the, other, parts of the Jewish population.
I think,
And similar with this idea of, how to interpret, the literalism, when you should be literal and when you shouldn't be literal. It's also something that's, a question in the greater Jewish,
Totally, it's at the heart of their rabbinic project, it's at the heart of what they're doing in their time period. Yeah.
So these are not just sort of offhand, issues.
Right, exactly, yes. Thank you for saying that. Any other comments or questions?
We are at time if you need to leave, but we started a little late, so if people have comments or questions, I want to keep it open for a little bit, so feel free.
I just wonder if there's a kind of a comparative analysis on cases like this versus cases where the opposite opinion, instead of mockery, asks clarifying questions, which obviously would be the right thing to do. And then I'm just wondering if it's just human nature, so sometimes obviously we just don't see the mockery, or indeed trying to tell us something different about these cases where...
Right, so I think on the one hand, it's kind of like what we just said, which is that a lot of these literal versus non-literal interpretation is kind of at the heart of the rabbinic project. Sometimes it's just human nature. I would say, open any halachic sugya in the Talmud, you'll see rabbis arguing over their interpretations, and they don't use mockery, right? It's more often than not, the Gemara doesn't tell us that they're using mockery. Maybe they definitely use insults. We find that, that could be a whole class on itself, right? Insults, yes, there's definitely other times. I think there's something different about laughter, and that's what I'm trying to do with these cases. What is it about these cases? So yeah, it's a great point. Yeah.
Is one of the issues about these cases that the issues are so important or so serious, or the questioning of the authority is so serious that they have to disarm the argument first, like you were saying, I can't remember who was saying it, that it puts people off, it makes them go as you were saying.
Right.
That it puts people off.
Yeah.
So it has to be used because it's sort of bringing in the most effective weapon
Right.
to fight against even talking about
Right.
the particular subject.
Right.
So they have to sort of disarm the people and
Yes, I think that's true. I think the stakes are higher than we might think. I think that it's very important to the rabbis that they get the correct interpretation. And if you're reading Tanakh wrong, that's a big problem. Like, not a little problem. It's like a big problem. So they have to just like dismiss you out of hand, and without really thinking through, why are they dismissing this person so quickly? Yeah.
I think one of my takeaways from this conversation is that the rabbis that they brought in was subtlety.
Yeah.
There was no, so maybe it's because it was groupthink, maybe because of what their ultimate goal was in terms of their project.
Right.
But they didn't have room for subtlety.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. Are they subtle? I mean, it's hard in the format that the Gemara is written in that we have it. It's not very subtle because it's short, terse lines, right? So we have quick opinions back and forth. So in that sense, it's not so subtle. But I think when you read, we could call it like reading against the grain and start reading it as the anonymous voice, the editor is trying to like put it together, then we see there's like more subtlety to it. And there's like a little bit more nuance in what each of the rabbis are saying. But I think you're right. Like there is a lack of subtlety, maybe because it is just so important to them. They can't spend time on it. Yeah.
You mentioned that you could explain why you think that particular section was in the Bavli but was not in the Yerushalmi.
Right. Yes, I can speak to that very briefly. I think the Bavli, as many people have shown, is really very reflective and indicative of a culture we will call the Stama'itic culture, which is the culture of the Stama'im, the editors of the Gemara, who had these sort of gigantic yeshivot. They would have these very big Beit Midrash settings where they would sit in many, many rows. Think about all these midrashim that talk about it, like they sit in these lots of rows. They have a teacher in the front. It's very performative in that way. The stakes are very high in that way. Shame is very high in the Beit Midrash in that kind of culture. And they read it back onto the stories of the Amoraim that are like a couple of generations before them. They don't do that in the Yerushalmi because the Yerushalmi doesn't have that culture. They don't have those Stama'im doing the same thing to the Yerushalmi. It doesn't have the same type of shame culture. It doesn't have the same humiliation culture in the Yerushalmi. That is something that really we only find in the Bavli, in a lot of other settings, not just in the laughing, but humiliation in general is very much present in the Bavli. Yeah.
I'm wondering, why do you think in Brachot, so there's an explicit rebuke, like don't laugh.
Yeah.
But in Zvachim, there's no explicit, is it clear to you that it is mockery? Obviously it's the same Shoresh, but is there some elasticity in that type of laughter, or it's always mockery?
I think it's always mockery, specifically this verb, especially when you find it elsewhere. I could definitely do more research into that, but I think almost always you see this verb and it's laughter. Yeah, the defense is definitely different, and it's worth, really here in the Zvachim case, he defends him with an interpretation. He reinterprets Rav Yosef's position to make sense.
And Rav Yosef speaks again, so
clearly
he's not totally humiliated.
Yeah, so he doesn't seem so humiliated. His teacher stands up for him, and he makes fun of them. Yeah, it's very tit for tat, really quick, and they make fun of each other.
You can't read it as playful.
I think you could read it as playful. I think you definitely could, but there's still a reason that I think this verb is used when elsewhere it's always mocking. Yeah.
It's funny because you said you're not sure how effective that would be as a teaching, as a pedagogical device, but I feel like that's exactly what you do when you teach little kids.
Yeah.
You'll say something really silly, and then they're like, no, of course not, and they'll give you the right answer.
Right.
I do feel and so the fact that he's calling them B'nai Ketara also seems significant of you are children.
Right, and yeah, that's really interesting. I like that a lot. That's great.
Does the mockery include sarcasm? That
fear, but sarcasm and